Hi everyone, I'm back and from Climate Smart Healthcare, we'll be talking about climate and pandemics. Scientists have spoken about the links between viral spillovers and how the things that propel climate change forward are very much the same things that increase the world's risk of infectious disease spread. Talk about land use change, talk about deforestation. So I'm really excited to be speaking today with Dr. Dennis Carroll, Senior Advisor for Global Health Security at URC. Thank you, Dennis, for joining us today. And Dennis will also be speaking at a breakout session on health and climate later at 2:45 ET. So it's a great chance if you have a question for him or want to interact with him, or if you're looking to establish partnerships on this topic. So don't miss that opportunity. So Dennis, there's a lot of talk now on pandemic preparedness, and in discussions on a potential pandemic treaty, one idea that's being pushed is really, the closure of wildlife markets. But is anything being done, or is enough attention being paid to address these drivers of both climate change and infectious disease spread? And what are the implications of inaction or lack of action?
Great. Well, Jenny, first off, it's a great question. And let me just offer sort of a divergence here. I think even as we talk about pandemic preparedness, we should also be talking about pandemic prevention. Because as you talked about before, there's a strong correlation between the spillover events between wildlife animals that are hosting potentially dangerous viruses into people. And a key underlying driver for that is the disruptive impact that we're having on the ecosystem around us. And one of the most telling disruptive events is that land use change. 100 years ago, there were 2 billion people on this planet. In the space of 10 decades, we've added 6 billion additional people. And by the end of this century, we're going to add another 4 billion. And that explosive, unprecedented increase in human population is really the big driver behind all of that land use change as we build out our settlements for people to live. And most importantly, we expand our agriculture to be able to feed the populations. And so as we go forward, that's going to be even more challenging. And we know that as we disrupt and destroy the forests and the jungles around us as a way of expanding our ability to feed the people, we're also creating opportunities for our settlements to be proximal to wildlife areas where species that are able to cohabitate with human settlements, such as bats, for instance, we have a much more intimate relationship with those animals than at any other previous time. And that is the challenge we have, is how do we expand our population and be less disruptive? And part of it is we have to pay attention. If we can pay attention and are much more thoughtful about how we establish that footprint, I go back to the notion we can prevent spillovers. They're not a necessary consequence of us living on this planet. They're an unintended consequence and largely driven by our negligence in how we expand. So if we're more thoughtful about our agriculture, we're more thoughtful about our settlement expansions, we have the real opportunity to move into the future with really lowering the risk of future pandemic threats. Even as we prepare for them, we have the opportunity to really lower the risk and prevent that next pandemic from ever happening if we take control of how we build our settlements and how we expand our agriculture. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much for highlighting that it's not just about preparedness, it's also about pandemic prevention. I want to follow up on that. Is enough being done on pandemic prevention at the moment?
No, absolutely not. And one of the sad things that we've seen over the last 20 years, after we've had each of these scares about pandemics and epidemics, and today as we live in the midst of an historic pandemic, our ability to really learn the proper lessons that each of these events have told us. They've given us an opportunity each time, whether we're talking about Ebola, whether we're talking about influenza pandemics or COVID-19. The writing is clearly on the wall, and we're just collectively doing a miserable exercise in learning those lessons. So we have some serious discussions, dialogues, and really some aggressive policy reform that we need to bring into play that really focuses on how do we manage our settlement expansions? How do we manage our agricultural expansions in ways that give us the benefits but avoids the unintended consequences. So we have some serious roll up our sleeves and get this job done work ahead of us. We're not at this point doing a very good job in coalescing the kind of partnerships that will drive this discussion forward and bring us into a new world that's far safer than the one we live in today.
You mentioned about partnerships, and in a previous conversation we've had, you mentioned the need for information really to help guide, inform, ultimately drive policymakers to action, protect the ecosystem for climate change purposes, but also in preventing future emerging health threats. I want to know, how can technology and partnerships help bring that information to drive policy action?
Well, one of the real truisms that's there is that as we talk about future pandemics, every future microbe that will be the cause of that pandemic already exists, either in its current form or in a precursor form. And it exists circulating in wildlife. What we really need to do is to enhance our ability to do the kind of surveillance that tells us where these viruses are circulating, what species of animals, and to what extent the species that harbor them are at high risk of exposure to human populations or settlements. That is, they have a high risk of spillover. And we have a real opportunity to build the partnerships between the technology communities, particularly those investing in diagnostics, the ability to go out and rapidly determine what is circulating in the ecosystem around us, but also the analytics side to be able to transform that information into knowledge that allows us to be much more forward leaning. We have a chance to go to the virus, if you will, before the virus comes to us. And it's really building on partnerships and technologies that allow us to get that forward leaning information that allows us then to prevent and as well as prepare. So it's critical building a federation of partnerships around the world, beginning at the local level. This is not about global partnerships per se. It is about action at the local level, ultimately is the key to a future healthy world. And we need to have partnerships that transcend geography, transcend politics, and transcend our sort of sectoral stovepipes that we find ourselves in over the years.
Now, there's sort of this discussion now happening around a potential pandemic treaty, and negotiators are supposed to be meeting, in the next few weeks. I wonder what message it sends to negotiators for this, instrument.
Well, first off, let's make sure that when we talk about a pandemic treaty, we're not building a pandemic treaty around our past experiences. We always have a tendency to prepare for the last war. We really have to be much more insightful and recognize the diversity of future threats that we are going to be faced with, and make sure that any pandemic treaty has the flexibility and the adaptability to be able to respond to the real reality of what we're going to face tomorrow, not the reality we faced yesterday. You've gone on mute, Jenny. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Really, for all of this insightful discussions.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and good luck.